This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
In 2012, Alaskan law enforcement came face-to-face with perhaps one of this country's most prolific serial killers. His name is Israel Keyes. Over the next 7 months, he played a cat-and-mouse game with investigators, divulging clues about other victims. So Peter Van Sant got a first look at the evidence and a look at the FBI's case.
Just please help find my daughter.
In February of 2012, 18-year-old Samantha Koenig vanished after her night shift at this roadside espresso stand. Residents of Anchorage, Alaska were shaken.
It basically looked like someone just literally walked out of their shift.
But Samantha had not walked out voluntarily. The next day, investigators watched what happened unfold on security camera video. A masked assailant had approached the window.
When you raise your hands like that, it's usually because somebody's doing
Something, exactly.
FBI Special Agent Jolene Godin was part of the team trying to find Samantha.
At this point, you see an individual jump in through the window.
Right through the window?
Right through the window.
Have you ever seen something like that before?
No. And then you see two individuals walk away. It looks like an abduction.
After tracking unusual activity on Samantha's ATM card, police arrested 34-year-old Israel Keyes 4,000 miles away in Texas.
And who the heck is Israel Keyes?
Israel Keyes was not even on our radar.
What they didn't realize at the time is that they had just arrested one of the most monstrous serial killers in American history.
Once I started, and there was nothing else like it.
Keyes confessed to killing Samantha Koenig and over the course of several months pointed investigators to 3 other victims, Bill and Lorraine Currier in Vermont and Deborah Feldman in New York.
Why did you pick these folks?
I didn't. It was just random.
But investigators believe that there are at least 7 more victims based on these drawings found in Israel Keyes' cell, drawn in his own blood.
Has the public ever been shown this before?
No.
And the significance of 11 skulls?
We believe that 11 is the total number of victims.
And investigators, like FBI Special Agent Catherine Nelson, are determined to identify them.
Do you have an optimistic streak that says we can find answers to the other 7 cases?
I do. I absolutely do. And it won't be easy by any means. And it may take a long time, but I'll never give up trying.
So Peter Van Sant is joining us now. Peter, aside from those creepy pictures, why do investigators believe that there are other victims and that they could be all over the country?
Well, Israel Keyes loved to travel. He would fly to some part of the United States, rent a car, and sometimes drive several thousand miles along the way. So he was in a whole bunch of states. I mean, this is just a partial list. Alaska, Vermont, Washington, Oregon, New York, New Jersey, California, Texas, Illinois, Tennessee, Indiana, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Minnesota, Nevada, and even parts of Canada. And he told authorities that when he had this compulsion to kill that would come over him, he would select someone completely at random. So they believe there are at least 11 deaths, but the speculation is with all that travel that he did and with his unusual compulsion, there may be many more.
Peter, the FBI showed you those drawings and other evidence for the very first time. What else did they show you, and why are they doing that? Why are they choosing this moment to do so?
Well, they called Israel Keyes the most meticulous serial killer in American history for a reason. He would pre-position these things he called kill caches. They'd be like an orange barrel. Inside would be a gun, weapons, a rope, zip ties, things that he would use that if he was driving in an area and wanted to kill somebody, he could access this cache and use that for his abduction and murder. And the reason why the FBI is showing us these haunting pictures, as you see here, and the kill cache items, is that they want people to call the FBI if they have a missing loved one, a missing persons case that's never been solved. Somebody was out hiking, because remember, he took people completely at random and often went to trailheads to get hikers and things. So they're hoping that the public will come forward with questions, with tips that, hey, I have a loved one that may have been one of his victims.
It's getting to the point now that I can't get certain cases out of my head. There's a case in Washington that I've come across that started to drive me nuts. It's very similar to Rebecca Brommel. There's sort of circumstantial evidence that leads me to believe. But the problem is it's a found body, and that gets complicated. There's these fires in New York that we keep coming back around to. But some of the weirdest stuff is, like, there's 2 cases in Texas I absolutely cannot get out of my mind. They literally go missing as Israel Keys drives by them. And they're not talked about anywhere. And the stories that are told don't line up with, like, anything you've ever thought of when it comes to Israel Keys. So there's those. But then this year, I'm having there's another state that's involved that I'm having a little trouble getting law enforcement to give me files. One of them is the found body. She's found, like, long after Keys is deceased. And then the other guy hasn't been found yet. But the story around how he went missing, there's an absolutely chilling component to it that basically Keys may have come face to face with the last person that saw this guy alive, and they didn't even realize who each other was, because Keys essentially grabbed the guy and might have thought that the person who saw him was him, and then the person who potentially saw the abductor thought it was the victim. That case, when I say it's chilling, it's absolutely terrifying. And it's one of the only cases I've found where a person goes missing from one place, car turns up in another place. And when I started asking for the files on this, when I say another place, I mean, the person went missing in one state, car turns up in another state, and these 2 murders happened really close together. When I went to ask for the files on this, they didn't want to give them to me. And I couldn't figure out why at first. And I had a similar problem down in Texas where when I went to ask for something, in these cases, you gotta realize these cases are 10 years old. So there shouldn't be a whole lot of holdback at this point that can't be easily redacted, I would think. But there's 2 particular missing persons cases that I thought I could get them by hand. I couldn't get them through a lawyer. I couldn't get them through open records request. I couldn't get them through FOIA. I cannot figure out, like, why they're sitting on these 2 particular files. I've got one of those cases in Washington that's similar to that, and then I've got the 2 people that disappear, like, within a 24-hour period, and then I've got the other 2 cases. It's not the same time period. It's about a month apart, but I think, like, once I lay it out, I think people will understand what I'm saying there.
Where we left off, we have some questions about some of the NamUs comparisons that are going to come up, including, do the numbers make sense? But we also have this one number, which is NamUs missing person number 13744, that's in the comparison searches that we have not yet accounted for what's going on there. And I went back through to listen. It seems like we mentioned it at some point in season 1. There were pretty extensive notes taken on the episodes here. Not exact transcripts, but pretty extensive notes where my wife has put all of those into a spreadsheet for me to look at with all the names. I cannot figure out what we did with that. So at some point, we're going to have to come back and address it. But I didn't want to just stop what we're doing on this episode because I still think that some of what we're talking about and handling as far as the Keys case goes right now, I think it's relevant. Even if it's not the exact thing we're talking about, it's going to be something similar. Where we had left off was the possibility of Rebecca Brommel as a Keys victim. And now It's interesting that she comes up with us because she also comes up in the Eugene Weekly in April 29th of this year. Out of the Void, it's a guy named Brenton Gicker. He wrote up a little bit about Rebecca Bromwell's disappearance, and I want to mention that here. He did it because in January there was a timber crew. There was a timber crew planting trees in rural Clackamas County, and they found a skull. That death is being investigated as a homicide. But what was interesting is Jim Ryan over at the Oregonian, he said that the remains predate the devastating wildfires that swept through the area in September. That deputies said that clothing scraps suggest that these remains may have been at this location for some time. So basically, Brenton kind of took a look at that, and he was poking around in some of the old missing persons cases. And he came back to do a little write-up here. And this is his write-up. When Portland resident Ruth Ann Albro read about the unidentified remains that were discovered on Weyerhaeuser property in Malala earlier this year, months after summer wildfires devastated this area, she found herself filled with emotion. After all, her little sister, Rebecca Noel Bromwell, disappeared from Portland in late April of 2007. And the vehicle she borrowed from a friend was found abandoned on an isolated logging road, also owned by Weyerhaeuser, which some places say Weyerhaeuser, but Weyerhaeuser is the big paper company. This is in rural Lane County, east of Springfield, in an area that was also devastated by late 2020 wildfires. Nobody knows for certain what happened to Rebecca, but it's assumed that she died in the wilderness surrounding where her vehicle was located, an area that she had previously visited with her boyfriend at the time, Gary Weaverly. According to Weaverly, the vehicle was found heading into the forest with a shredded flat tire and an empty gas tank. She apparently laid out the contents of her wallet on the dashboard with a prized cigarette case in the middle. These were the only clues left to her fate. Albro wondered, like the remains found in Clackamas, could the ashes of the Holiday Farms fire turn up skeletal remains or other evidence of what happened to Rebecca 14 years ago? Who was Rebecca Bromwell? Rebecca was born January 9th, 1981 in Portland. She was the youngest of 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys. Rebecca grew up in the Portland area where she resided at the time of her disappearance. According to her sister, Rebecca, who studied horticulture and contemplated a career in landscape architecture, was a lifelong lover of nature, growing them, pruning them, and being in nature, admiring them. Rebecca loved plants, she says. Rebecca also enjoyed mountain biking, jewelry making, and painting. Becca was beautiful inside and out. She loved her nieces and nephews, spoiled them with Chevron cars and books. She loved my mom and my granny. She loved making art and growing plants. She was a tomboy for most of her life, made friends with anyone and everyone, loved babies, nature, and dirt bikes. Weaverly says Rebecca could make plants thrive through the sheer force of will. She was truly gifted at horticulture. She was sweet and kind. She'd give a cigarette to anyone who asked. She loved the Ramones and would watch The Big Lebowski on a loop. Weaverly continues. She loved her brothers, her sisters, and especially her nieces and nephews. She loved her mom and would always make sure that we attended Sunday dinner. In the months before her disappearance, Rebecca's behavior was erratic. Evidence of what Weaverly and Albro believed was an undiagnosed bipolar disorder. I believe she was in a manic state prior to disappearing, Albro says. In addition to staying up all night ranting and raving and coming up with grandiose plans, Rebecca began drinking heavily and racking up massive credit card debt, and generally became out of control, according to Weaverly. He took her to an appointment with a mental health specialist, but she never followed through with the treatment. Rebecca's relationship with Weaverly, friends, and family had become strained. The last time anyone saw her was when she showed up at her mother's Portland residence in late April of 2007. It was late, Rebecca was behaving strangely. Her mother asked her to go home and get some sleep. Weaverly says he saw her a day or two before that when she arrived at my house about 3 a.m., drunk and babbling. I was able to get her to lie down, and she immediately fell asleep, and in the morning, she left promptly. Weaverly never heard from her again. What happened to Rebecca Bromwell? I had no reason to believe that she was a danger to others, Weaverly said, but she clearly had become a danger to herself. More than once, she told me that the world would be a better place if she never existed. A major setback in figuring out what happened to Rebecca was the gap between when her vehicle turned up and when the tow company notified the owner that it had been recovered. The vehicle sat on the tow lot for about a month before the owner was notified. The tow company should have notified the police about the vehicle immediately, which would have triggered a search effort. The tow company's negligence resulted in a major delay in search efforts that might have been successful had they been conducted sooner. While there are a number of possibilities, we may never know what really happened to Rebecca. She most likely committed suicide. This is according to Brenton. According to Weaverly, she drove her friend's truck into the forest as far as it would go. I believe that with the same force of will she exhibited with plants, she deliberately let herself die. I think she managed to hide herself deep in the forest and purposely stayed in that location until death. I think she is still there. It was her one perfect act. She truly disappeared without a trace, trying to fulfill the sad wish to have never existed. Of course, for those who loved her, that erasure was never possible. And Brenton Gicker, he is a registered nurse. He lives in the Eugene and Springfield areas. He has written several stories about local missing people. You can reach him at outfromthevoid@yahoo.com. And you can usually just find him by Googling Brenton Gicker. He is someone I would like to talk to on the show at some point. Rebecca Bromwell, what is your take on her?
I think that she more than likely either she may have purposely committed suicide or she misadventured herself into it.
I really think this is one of Key's victims.
Well, what makes you think that?
Well, the tire being shredded.
Do you think that the comment about how she drove the truck as far into the woods as she could, to me, that sort of offset that. Like, she was probably a little further than she should have been.
Well, 90% of missing people cases involve persons who have some level of mental illness. And that statistic has proven to be fairly reliable. And I absolutely believe that is a possibility here. But I recently started hunting down a different case, and that was not related to what we're doing. There's a 3-part series that this podcast called The Vanished has covered on a guy named Ian Eccles, and he went missing out in Washington. And the gist of his story is very simple. He went on a hunting trip. He was never seen again, and someone else turned up driving his vehicle, who was then linked to multiple murders. That's his whole story right now because they still haven't found his body. And that guy has pled guilty to a number of charges but refuses to plead to the murders. This all happened right when the pandemic onset. And he, to hide the vehicles, would drive the vehicles deep into the woods. His name is Jorge Acento or something like that. If you want to know more about that story, you should go and listen to The Vanished. I know they've at least released 2 of the 3 parts, but this is the story of Ian Eccles going missing. My point is, everything that could possibly go wrong ended up going wrong for that killer, if he is the killer. And he hasn't gone on trial for the murders yet. He's just gone up for the theft of multiple vehicles, including murder victims' vehicles. He got off because one of the victims, it was right when the pandemic started, and she was left in her home for multiple weeks, and everybody just thought that she was very elderly, and they thought that she had just died. So the family had her body cremated, and there was no autopsy. And then afterwards, they realized that this guy had her car. My point is, he was driving the vehicles deep into the woods, like this. And I think that might be more what Israel Keyes would have done than Rebecca Bromwell would have done. And it is a possibility that she killed herself. It's also a possibility that someone close to her took advantage of some situation. Even when I've read, there's very little about her case out there.
Well, I think that's because there's a consensus.
Yeah, there's a consensus that she killed herself.
Right. And so like you read the article, I typically take, especially if you got multiple people talking about, and in that article, it was the boyfriend, the sister, and the mother, they all saw erratic behavior. If it's just one, like if it was just the boyfriend, it would raise my suspicion flag as far as, did he do something? But when you've got multiple people talking about it, it's actually really sad. But when you've got a grown adult, there's not a whole lot you can do if you've tried to get them help and they don't want it.
Yeah.
Now, because she, in theory, is out in the woods, because she borrowed someone's vehicle. The vehicle was found. It sat in a tow yard for a month. And then the owner was finally notified. So it would fit the criteria that, like, there was no news about her. Right? I don't know how long it took for them to report her missing. It actually sounds like her sort of vague. I guess maybe the person who lent her the vehicle would know the last time they saw her, unless it was...
Well, the vehicle was reported stolen after a while. It has this weird window where the vehicle turns up and it's towed, and then it's reported stolen because the owner basically was like, where the fuck did she go with my car?
Right.
So they use the date of last contact they use is April 30th because that's when that is the night that her mom saw her.
Okay, so it might have even been a few more days.
Right. So give or take, it's somewhere around. She wasn't reported missing right away. She was noticed and eventually was reported missing, but there is some serious distance.
Right, because she was acting weird and nobody wanted to deal with it. Nobody could deal with it, I guess.
No, I think it sounds like a lot of efforts have been made on behalf of her family. I think they thought that eventually everything would be okay.
Well, sure. And if you've tried what you can try, I mean, she wasn't a child, so...
Her date of last contact is April 30th. She's in NamUs as of October 7th, 2010. Rebecca Brommel was 5 feet 7 inches tall, weighed around 150 to 160 pounds. She had brown hair. She had hazel eyes. She had a lot of tattoos, including multiple tattoos on her legs and her back. She was 26 years old. She was reported to be in and out of local bars and drinking quite a bit in the days before she vanished. They don't have a good description of what she was wearing. The vehicle that she was driving turned out to be reported stolen, even though it was just found essentially disabled. She drove it until it wouldn't drive anymore. You know, and that there's a number of things that like pop into my head there. Like if that happened, like, okay, so if I'm right and it's a serial killer that's taken her out and like done something with her, how does he get back out of the woods? So, you know, you start asking yourselves all these questions about why would he do that?
It would almost be like if somebody really wanted to do themselves in, it would almost be too lucky that a serial killer would be out there waiting for them.
Yeah, we've talked about that before, but you know, so you're aware, like the distance from where she was last seen to where this vehicle was found was 3 hours. So it's 3 hours south, and it's off a highway, and it's along a service road that attaches back to a service road that attaches back to a highway. It's pretty far out there, and I was able to find the exact location of the vehicle, and it was past the tree line, so it's in there. It's this place called Lumber Heritage is what it used to be called. It was essentially a landfill they called it the Weyerhaeuser Truck Road Landfill.
And so you feel like the proximity and the different circumstances.
Yeah, it's off Highway 5. It's headed into Umpqua there, which is the national forest. Like it's at the base of that. So Willamette is north of there. It's all national forest land. Like actually, if you like look down through there, Crater Lake is there too. So it's like all these national forests and parks stacked on each other that Weyerhaeuser owns a piece of the kind of the abutment to it. And here's my thinking. These FBI tips have come in and like, I don't put any stock in them. I put zero stock in them. I pay zero attention to them. But I have noticed that some of them say like he asked people questions and like, would anybody know if you missed them? So I'm not saying this is even necessarily our serial killer that we're looking at, but if it were a serial killer, it's highly unlikely that a highly suicidal person would be lucky enough to meet a serial killer. That sounds backwards when I say it, but basically they want a way out. They don't want to do it themselves. They run across this person. However, erratic and manic behavior, like there's a crash that happens afterwards that people do end up killing themselves. So that could also be the case here. It's kind of a weird way to kill yourself.
To go sit in the middle of the woods?
Yeah, like, so if she wanted to truly... So first of all, if you tell me that that's what she wanted to do and you knew her and, like, you start telling me this is her perfect thing, I start to immediately think, that guy did it. Those are the first words out of my mouth.
There's too many people who've witnessed the erratic behavior, though.
I understand that, but erratic behavior is one thing. I don't think anybody looked for her.
Well, why would they? She literally walked out of their lives.
Well, that's the other thing I discovered was the land where the vehicle was found has not been searched either. Not to
No, because they just towed the vehicle. They had no idea there was a person involved.
Right.
Because it sat on the tow yard for a whole month. Right, you're right. There has been no effort to find evidence. Essentially, they towed an abandoned vehicle.
Right. They towed an empty abandoned vehicle with a busted tire and an empty gas tank.
Man, she just drove as far as she could.
Maybe. I absolutely believe. So one of the reasons like I keep bringing up these like weird little cases like this is eventually you're going to find evidence that will lead you to other evidence and other cases because of the way bodies are discovered or because of what is left with them or because of stashes that are nearby. This one is complicated because there's a vehicle right there, which makes me think, well, she's not there if it's a serial killer, unless they absolutely knew.
Well, do you think Keyes would drive a car or a vehicle that was about to run out of gas?
I think Keyes might drive a vehicle till it ran out of gas.
If he did, he didn't have anybody with him.
No, he said that. He had Samantha Koenig in his truck, and he said he didn't want to run out of gas because what kind of problem would that be? Now, we haven't heard the words out of his mouth, but we've read them from two sources.
I'm just saying, let's say that this were the case. Keyes would have met up with her in the woods somewhere. He didn't drive the vehicle until it ran out of gas.
I don't know what to tell you. You're right to question everything I'm saying. Yeah, I mean, I maybe found her in a parking lot. I'm just saying her car's a long way from home. There's this little lake there called Cottage Grove Lake that is right by where her car was. And what I thought was maybe she went to Cottage Grove Lake and thought to herself, you know, this is where I'm going to end everything. Maybe he was fishing at Cottage Grove Lake because, you know, that's a popular area for water skiing and swimming. It's supposedly some of the best fishing in the state of Oregon to go to Cottage Grove. And this is within 2 or 3 miles of where her car was found. My only thinking there is maybe he was fishing and she was trying to get away. And so what we see is like the shredded tire and the empty gas tank was really just he picked it up at Cottage Grove and needed to bury it further in the woods. So he did because he took her there. But anyways, Cottage Grove Lake is now on my list because of Rebecca Brommel. That's where I was sort of getting with all of this. And I know this is complicated to follow because it's hard for me to get it all out in a way that like sounds sensible to other people. And half the time, I think I just sound like a crazy person. So there's a couple things I wanted to talk about today that are weird ones. First one is we mentioned Deborah Feldman recently. And I wanted to kind of follow this like train of thought of what I just said with Rebecca Brommel and combine it with the idea of Texas, like things that we know happened down in Texas, particularly with the fire in Texas. I ran down a bunch of different events that happened sort of in his timeline or kill zone or whatever you want to call it. And I came across one that I cannot get out of my head. It doesn't fit the timeline exactly. And I think maybe that's why I can't get it out of my head. In 2009, so I'm skipping ahead, Rebecca Brommel is in April of 2007. And now I'm in April of 2009. But where I'm at is Keyes has just committed the Tupper Lake bank robbery. And supposedly what happens, according to the FBI's timeline on him, is he gets on an airplane and he flies back to Anchorage, Alaska on April the 14th of 2009. What you were able to track down through going through the interviews, and when I say interviews, I mean interviews the FBI conducted, was it seemed to you that he had gone there but never visited his brothers or anyone else in Maine on this trip.
That's what he said, but it was not like, it wasn't definitive. He was just like, I don't think I saw my brothers that year. And so that would have been in reference to around the Tupper Lake bank robbery.
On April 21st, which is 7 days later, and technically he's supposed to have flown out, I came across a fire that shouldn't have been a fire. And whenever I come across these, I always think back to there's a lot of arson fires that happen, by the way. So I'm not claiming any of these are, I'm not claiming to be spot on with my understanding of what's happened here. But this is in the Troy record in April of 2009. Essentially, an entire...
That's Troy, New York, right?
This is Troy, New York. Yeah, this is in New York. This is actually... So this is in Valley Falls, New York. And here's like the article from the record from April 22nd of 2009. In its better days, the devastating fire that leveled a century-old mill complex Wednesday would have been heralded by 3 whistles. That was the signal issued by the Thompson Mills to signal a fire at what was once the economic nexus of the small village of 500. But those days are gone, and now so are the mills that once manufactured twine and mesh here. 20 fire departments from 3 counties responded to the blaze at the Route 67 complex, which began around 4:30 a.m. It took 2 hours to get the blaze under control, said Valley Falls Fire Chief Wesley Whedon. But by 2 p.m., piles of rubble were still burning because firefighters were unable to get close to it for fear that what is left of the building's frame might collapse. No firefighters were hurt battling the blaze, and Whedon wanted to keep it that way. The benefit of putting the fire out is not worth the risk of putting our firefighters in that position. An afternoon shower likely aided the department in the efforts. The cause of the fire is currently unknown, and it's under investigation by state and county investigators. Wheaton said that a week and a half before, a portion of one of the buildings before the fire, there were 3, collapsed. This facility was first built in 1860 by James Thompson and Company, and through the first half of the 20th century, the mills were the economic centerpiece of this village. They employed the bulk of the population, Weaver said, especially after nearby power mills closed in the 1930s. People would walk the short distance from their homes to the mills, and the mills would blow 3 whistles each day, one in the morning to signal the start of the workday, one to send everyone home for lunch, and another to end the day at 5 p.m. But if 3 consecutive whistles pierced the air, it signaled danger. It meant a likely fire at the mills, and help had better come quick. It was a different time than it is now. In 1970, the company moved its primary operations to Delaware, and the sparse skeleton crews that had continued to work the mills at night began to leave. It sat vacant from then on, changing owners several times before remaining closed. Its current owner of record has not paid taxes on the village in roughly a half-dozen years, but a county spokesman said that the county had not begun the process of repossessing the property. It really was a viable part of the village for many years, but fell into disrepair, as many things do. What's going on here is this massive, and like, I think I'm going to link to some photos of this so that people can see what I'm talking about, how big this is. The Thompson Mills in Valley Falls, New York, are a pretty formidable presence, but they're right along a river. What is so interesting about this for me, so it's along the Hoosick River that this, when they say it's a tiny village, it really, really is a tiny little village.
You said 500 people, right?
Yeah, it's 500 people. So the first thing that interested me about this was, this is not the Adirondacks. So this is actually like driving back down from Constable. It would be like you were headed to Albany, but don't quite get there. So if you were to, you get to this highway, and if you were to make a left, you're suddenly in Vermont. And if you were to make a right, you're in Albany. But where you are is Valley Falls. It's a tiny, like even the county itself is pretty small. And the population in this particular town has been going down, not up. The county has about 150,000 people. This, as of this year, this city, village, whatever you want to call it, it's not a city anymore. It's only 400 people. What was so interesting about this is this little area is right in the middle of a ton of people from the missing persons cases that we had. This fire is later ruled to be arson of undetermined origin. There was nothing there that could have sparked this fire. This is a shut down, abandoned property, and suddenly, so it's one thing to burn a house down. Okay, burning a house down happens. Particularly houses have electrical fires. It's pretty easy to go into a house with an accelerant, and as long as it's a house under. It's just a couple thousand square feet. It's pretty easy to make it a big roaring blaze. But one of the things he talks about is carrying around diesel fuel. And I firmly believe in order to have this fire, which the images of it is huge. And it basically destroys 2 of the 3 buildings here. This fire reminded me of Texas because it's 2 separate buildings being burned down at one time in a way that basically has to be arson. And it's 3 hours away from Constable, New York.
It's also 3 hours away from Manchester, New Hampshire, which is where he flew in.
Right.
And if you sort of follow his, like what we know about him, it would be in like sort of his pattern of doing things. As far as like, because he said, and we don't know for certain, but he did say, I didn't go visit anybody in Maine on that trip. And so he would have been like flying into Manchester. Troy would be, he could go through Troy on his way to Constable, New York. And so the magnitude of the fire, the way the fire went, the location of the fire, I totally see it. The only problem we have is that
supposedly he flew away.
Right, according to records. Okay, and then you said something that was intriguing to me. What did you say about part of the building collapsing?
So a piece of the building had collapsed a week earlier, and he would have been there. And
right. That's actually really interesting to me, and that made me wonder if he somehow...
I think there's bodies in this place, man. That's what I'm saying.
Well,
They didn't excavate it. They didn't do anything to it. It's just there.
Is it still there?
Yeah. Now they've had other fires. They've had all sorts of problems at this location. When I say it's pretty isolated, for New York, it's amazingly isolated. But they've had problems at this location, like even since this. But once one of these mills, like you have to understand that mill was 100 years old when it had the fire. So,
well, that definitely would have been like an abandoned building, would have most certainly caught Keyes' attention.
It was for sale that year. It had a giant for sale sign and it was on the internet.
That would have really caught his attention. And so I do think that he looked at stuff like that. So we're looking at a situation where either he didn't actually take the flight back, or he did take the flight back, but then he returned, right?
And that's sort of where I'm stuck.
Okay. And then we don't have... so he turned the rental car in. I don't know. Have you done? I haven't done the math on the rental car we know he had, as far as like how far he could have gone and like if this would work out that way. One thing that's bothered me is I don't understand why investigators didn't straight up ask him if there was a fire, because he confessed to the Tupper Lake bank robbery.
Yeah.
And they never said, well, did you set fire to something? Not that I heard. Do you recall?
They did not ask. They did not ask in anything that's been released to us. And I firmly believe that this particular case, like this fire. Okay, so remember how he's all jittery when they're talking about Deborah Feldman and Tupper Lake, and like he felt like he almost got caught by the cops and all that stuff related to this? This, like, unless he actually pulled off some of the other fires that I have questions about, this would have been fucking epic. Like, I'll put pictures in here. I'll put links in the show notes so that people can see it. But this fire in the dead of night, because it's like this fire was amazing to behold.
And so we just have to get him there.
Well, I picture we have to get him to here. That's
and as far as I know, so my thought was, well, since he turns in the rental car, we know for sure on the 14th or around when he was supposed to fly out. And, according to records that have been gathered, he didn't rent another car, at least not that anybody.
No, we need a missing person with a vehicle.
We need a person who's missing with their vehicle, and there's just not one.
But the problem is, okay, and this is where the FBI screwed up, I think. And I don't want to make the same mistake, so this comes up again in a little bit. But, all right, if you look at New York in April of 2009, you can kind of get an idea for... You were saying something about the rental car mileage earlier. The way the investigators ran it was they went Manchester to Constable to Tupper Lake, which they're in the same little area, and then back to Manchester. And they deduced that he would have been able to travel down to New Jersey and been responsible for Deborah Feldman.
Right.
Which, I've got all kinds of odds with that whole thing anyways. But the thing about April of 2009 is there's really not that many missing people period, like for the whole month, not just for like the time period.
I looked like so much. I've stretched this as far as I could make it go. And I think it's got to be somebody who wasn't reported missing.
Well, remember, there's two people that we can't account for. Okay. And I'm going to bring them up because they're very complicated cases. So around the U.S. in April of 2009, there are 33 missing persons that are on record and reported. Unfortunately, some of them are too far away to make any sense in being related to this. There is a small child who went missing in Hampshire, Massachusetts, but mom is still alive. This is a parental abduction. Mom was originally reported missing, but stopped being an interesting missing persons case to me. There's a Wilda Moraro who she was up in Connecticut, but she did not have a vehicle. She was on foot.
Right, and she disappeared before he was in town.
Right, she disappeared. Even if all of that is screwed up.
And they double checked because of
the
same reason we would want them to double check.
So there's Carrie Heath. There's three candidates here. Carrie Heath is the first candidate. Carrie Heath was in Mills College in Oakland, California. What's interesting about Carrie's case is only a missing persons case in Buffalo, New York. So Carrie went missing because there was a problem with her class schedule at school. Essentially, if financial aid had not come through, they deleted class schedules for a number of students. And I went through all of this situation related to her Mills College classes in Oakland, California. But the gist of it is I never could figure out why Vitasha Tibbs was the detective on her case out of Buffalo, New York. And it seems that a family member was supposed to meet her. She was supposed to be coming from Oakland, California to Buffalo, New York. And the reason they reported her missing is because she didn't show up. But they thought she was supposed to show up on April the 1st. That really doesn't fit our timeline either. We had two other choices. I'll throw them out there because I've mentioned them before. I'm still Joey Giza is on the top of my list. Technically, Joey was last seen in Bloomington, Indiana on the night of April the 1st of 2009. And Joey was, his first name is Frank if you go looking for him. He's Frank Joseph Giza II. He had long curly hair. He was 6 foot tall, but he was super skinny. I think he only weighed about 140 pounds. He went missing from Bloomington, Indiana, and he was supposed to be meeting up with people at a music festival, and he just dropped off the radar. I don't know if you remember from his case, Meg, but there was some stuff that was in his backpack that ended up being mailed to people that seemed weird.
I do remember this guy. He didn't have a vehicle, right?
He did. Well, we don't know what he was far enough away from home for long enough that no one knew if he had a vehicle or not. There's another guy from Indianapolis, Indiana, from April 1st named John Paul Hurley. nobody knew what vehicle he had. He was a 45-year-old guy who was 5'8", 180 pounds. So those are the three candidates I came up with where I was kind of like, maybe these people. There's also Peter O'Brien. This is a guy who went missing, and I think his vehicle went with him. But he's in Idaho, so he's not anywhere nearby. So when you sit down and start looking at all of this, I think what you're going to find up there is that, first of all, I'm pretty sure that if you go to the old Thompson Mills building, to the two buildings that collapsed, to the building that collapsed and the two buildings that got set on fire, I think there's human remains there. But we need a person with a vehicle from somewhere.
Or he could have stolen a vehicle and taken a person.
It's just the vehicle, not the person. So I started looking at those. It's really hard.
He had to have had a way around, though. And I'm not saying that it's impossible for him to have figured something else out. But with all the rental car records they got, it would be really strange if, especially since he said he didn't see his brothers. I'm trying to think, like, when you rent a car, like, you've got to basically sign your entire life over to them.
Yeah.
You've got to prove your identity. And that's why there are such meticulous records, because you have to give so much information. But so he had to have had a way to get around. He would have absolutely been capable of stealing cars, but I mean, I have no idea what the statistics are on car theft, but I imagine it's a lot of cars get stolen. So I just don't know. And the reason that it becomes so questionable is because they've nailed it as Deborah Feldman being his victim during this time period. And the fire in Troy is intriguing because of the circumstances. And it's one of those things where you're like, Israel Keys was there a week earlier.
Right.
Are you kidding? Like, it's like, wow. Because it is such, like you said, it would have been an epic fire. And it just makes you wonder, like, well, what was he up to? And is it possible that, there's all kinds of things that are possible. He could have flown back and then driven himself back. I think you could probably drive from Alaska to New Hampshire in a week. I don't know that for certain, but I think so.
He could drive into Canada for sure. I don't know how far he would get. There was a missing guy from Poughkeepsie on April 20th. And I don't know how you do this, but sometimes I couldn't tell when exactly they went missing based on the information that was presented, because it's just seeking information and a description of the person. When I went to run all of that down, it turns out that he had probably been missing too far back to, it's another one like a Wilda. Keys wasn't there when the missing part happened. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I haven't, the people that you've named, I'm sort of familiar with their cases, and I'm still in search of who this person could be. And that's just my opinion. Just sort of based on what I've looked into, I really want to figure out who it is. And even we're going on almost 10 years here, 9 years. We're on 9 years. And a lot of people get reported missing much, much later, and we still got nobody. Yeah. Well, you've got 3, but I don't have that sort of feeling towards it. It doesn't mean you're wrong. It's just, I'm looking at more options, and I've been stuck on this for years. I mean, I have this dread coming back to this because it's so frustrating, and I know that the answer's close.
Yeah. Well, so on Tuesday, April the 14th in Rochester, New York, a 60-year-old man named Isaiah McCoy was found floating in the water there. I looked at his case because he just drops off the radar. Nobody knew how long he had been missing, and nobody really knew what could possibly have happened to him. But what really wrecks searching everything in this time period is that Brittany Drexel was missing. I don't know if you remember this happening, but when she went missing
in Myrtle Beach.
Yeah, but she was from New York.
Right, and she had gone without permission.
Right. So when you start hunting, looking for people when other people are missing, sometimes you can find yourself in these giant swaths of information that really take you nowhere. And for instance, in April of that year, there was a missing person that I have yet to find alive, but her family suddenly stopped searching for her, and she is from just north of the city in New York. I thought for sure that was going to be someone that he was looking for. I need to send you this because...
That who was looking for?
Hold on. That the FBI would look at. I'm just continuing this case for later. Just remember her because...
I don't have enough in my brain.
No. I just need you to quickly look and tell me if you see anything else on this woman, because I realized she is on this massive list where I haven't really been able to chase down all of the little leads. And with her, she went missing earlier, but never came back, and she usually came back. That was the thing about her. We do have like one more little piece to put together here, because I definitely think that this situation of what happened in this mill I think it's related to Israel Keys, and I think it might give us some clues or possible clues about what he was doing as far as travel goes. And if we can figure some of those pieces out, then I think they'll help us with other cases down the line. Should we come back around to Senor Idiot here? Should we come back around to Israel Keys? Go ahead.
Well, I just the fire is interesting. It's always driven me a little crazy that they didn't flat out. Nobody said like, well, did you set a fire then too? Because his sequence, he talked about like how he would kill somebody and he'd be amped up and he'd rob a bank and light a fire, and he had this whole, I don't really want to say ritual, but like he had this whole thing that he did, this whole routine that he did. It was so bizarre to me that they weren't like, okay, well, where was the fire around the Tupper Lake bank robbery? Nobody said anything.
With him, I always like wonder, where did those routines come from, and like where did those rituals come from? And this last little piece it's actually two parts, but one of the things I've done with this story as we've gone along is I've always looked for killers that have done the pit latrine thing, because, there's nothing healthier than filling your RSS feeds and your Google search alerts with the words outhouse, body found, latrine, pit toilet, remote toilet. There is one, weirdly enough. And what I realized was, even though I got a more recent hit on him, going back through, I'd never heard of this guy. But when I went back through his information, I realized that someone had published a book about him back in the early 2000s, and he had shown up several times in the 90s in New York, Washington, and Oregon papers. So that was interesting to me. But I want to just talk about him for a second, because one of the things I've always tried to do is to run down what Israel Keys was reading. I've been able to run down a number of things based on clues he gave us and things he said. For instance, one of the things that he said had to do with the Pinkertons and the situation with H.H. Holmes. The way that
turn of the century killers.
Right. He phrased things in a certain way that I was able to literally, he said some things incorrectly, is the gist of it. So I was able to go track down his incorrect statements and attribute them to an author and find out how he might have read something. I say that because I came across things like Reader's Digest editions and abridged editions that would have appeared in wide circulation, where he could have seen them on a military base, or he could have seen them different places that we could verify he had been at some point. There was a chance he came into contact with it. And plus, people read whatever. They get their hands on whatever. With this particular instance, I used the same mechanism I did. So I had gone back through and searched for particular phrases that Keys said in his interviews, where he talks about the castle and the Pinkertons and other things related to Holmes, and like you said, turn-of-the-century killers. And I came up with an interesting one, who is J. Frank Hickey. And that's the one who had several large media articles written about him in the 90s and a book written about him in the early 2000s. John Frank Hickey was an American child molester and a serial killer. And due to the postcards he mailed to the police and the media, he was dubbed the postcard killer. He was born in Lowell, Massachusetts, to Michael Hickey and Mary Ann McGrath, baptized Roman Catholic at St. Patrick's Church, which was 2 blocks from his parents' lodgings. In his early teens, Hickey joined Lowell's First Congregational Church on Kirk Street. He also became an official at the Lowell YMCA and the Christian Endeavor. On September 1st of 1883, 18-year-old Hickey contacted police and said that he had found 34-year-old pharmacist Edwin W. Morey dead on the floor of the McGivens drugstore where both of them had worked. Hickey claimed that Edwin had been despondent for some time due to alcoholism and that he'd been trying to help his coworker regain his sobriety. As the doctor believed that Morey had taken poison, a stomach pump was brought. At midnight, Edwin began to show some signs of life, but he died shortly after, around 3 o'clock in the morning. Years later, Hickey admitted to having murdered Morey with laudanum. He had been afraid that if their employer had found Edwin intoxicated, he might fire them both. He listed his occupation as the secretary of the YMCA, and Hickey applied for and received membership in Lowell's William North Masonic Lodge in 1887. In 1889, he became a Master Mason. Despite his later claims, Hickey never attained the rank of 32nd degree Freemason. Although his biographer Vance McLaughlin describes Hickey as having quit the Masons in June of 1895, Masonic records tell a different story. In March of 1895, Hickey was arrested in Lowell for stealing 20 gallons of alcohol from his employer. In response, the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts ruled Hickey a liar and profane. They expelled him from all the rights and privileges of Freemasonry. This was on June 12th of 1895. In 1896, Hickey left Lowell and would never live there again. Between then and 1902, he drifted around Canada and the northeastern United States working various industrial jobs. On December 10th, 1902, Hickey encountered Michael R. Kruk, who was an 11-year-old newspaper vendor. When Kruk offered to sell him a newspaper, Hickey responded that he would purchase all of them if the boy would simply follow him into Central Park. When Kruk did so, Hickey strangled him and left his body with the newspaper bundle under his head. The coroner later examined the body and found no evidence of sexual assault. The coroner's inquest ruled that Michael R. Kruk met his death by being strangled by some person or persons unknown to this jury. On December 12th, 1902, Michael Kruk's body was released from the morgue and he was buried at Brooklyn's Washington Jewish Cemetery. On October 12, 1911, Hickey was then employed as a steel supervisor in Lackawanna, New York. He noticed 7-year-old Joey Joseph playing at his father's men's furnishing store. Later, when Joey was making mud puddles with a friend in the street near his house, Hickey motioned to them to join him. He gave Joey a few pennies to buy some candy for himself and his friend. Upon Joey's return, Hickey abruptly told his friend that it was time for him to go home. Hickey then took Joey by his hand and led him to an outhouse behind a saloon on Ridge Road. There, Hickey strangled Joey into unconsciousness, sexually molested him, strangled him to death, and then dumped the boy's body into the outhouse pit. Despite the assistance of the Buffalo Police Department, the investigation into Joey Joseph's disappearance had almost zero leads. And on October 30th of 1911, a postcard was delivered to the Lackawanna police chief. It read, Joseph will be found on the bottom of a water closet with 3 seats back of the saloon near Doyle's on Ridge Road. A drunk, crazed brain done the deed, and remorse and sorrow for the parents is bringing results that will soon come to an end. The Demon Whiskey will then have one more victim, making 4 in all. Drag the closet with the 3 seats. Acting on the postcard tip, police found the closet, an outhouse behind the spot known as Doyle's Saloon. They poked around but saw nothing to suggest that a child's body was hidden there, assumed it was a crank message, and went on to pursue other leads. Now, this is written by Vance McLaughlin in his book on this case. It's called The Postcard Killer. Around the same time, Joey's father, George, started receiving postcards and letters about his missing son. Some suggested the child was still alive, and others contained blunt notes to the contrary. Don't search anymore for your boy. He's been choked to death. They have him buried where no one will find him. The messages stopped abruptly, and then they started again in August of 1912, arriving at the Joseph home, newspaper offices, and in police headquarters in both Lackawanna and Buffalo. Most of these postcards had Boston postmarks on them. The writer described how he watched Joey go into a candy store, then lured him into an alley. There were also graphic descriptions of how the child had been sexually assaulted, strangled, and dumped into the outhouse pit. More postcards and letters arrived. One was to the Buffalo police. It claimed responsibility for the unsolved murder of a newsboy named Michael Kruk, who was 11 from New York City Central Park a decade earlier. In another, the writer admitted to having murdered 12 other children. "Catch me if you can" was the closing taunt on one card. A few pointed to the outhouse behind Doyle's as the place where Joey's body could be found, prompting a second and more thorough investigation. On November 16th of 1912, a year after Joey's disappearance, investigators pulled from the cesspool a small skull and other body parts in various stages of decay. George Joseph identified his son after one look at the skull, which was missing 2 front teeth. Joey had lost those teeth shortly before his disappearance. "Body of murdered boy is found in the filth of a Lackawanna cesspool" was the headline of the Buffalo Evening Times the following day. Another paper, the Buffalo Evening News, printed photos of some of the postcards which led to a break in the case. Thomas Blass, a superintendent in the Lackawanna Steel Company, saw the postcards and told police that he recognized the handwriting. It matched that of a former employee, John Frank Hickey. So, by the time Hickey was 15 years old, he had a police record for theft. 3 years later is when his coworker died. So at this point in time, police tracked Hickey down at Keswick Colony, which was a sanitarium in New Jersey, and they arrested him for Joey's murder. And it seemed pretty hard for them to believe. Hickey was clean-cut, he was well-spoken, and he was not the image of a child killer.
But he was at a sanitarium.
In a sanitarium. He said, I mean, like, seriously,
that just seems really contradictory. I'm just saying, like, those statements contradict each other.
Well, it does like everything about this guy contradicts itself, though. He comes from sort of, humble beginnings and makes his way to being a serial killer. Although I did not know who he was before this. Did you?
No.
There was a witness who saw him. He had lived in a hotel close to where Joey's body was found. His signature was in the register, happened to have his full name and be a sample of his handwriting. Because of all the postcards, they were able to, use that to connect him.
Himself in.
Yeah. So a few days after Thanksgiving, Hickey confesses to murdering Joseph and to Kruk and to Edwin. And he said that the guilt over Edwin's death drove him to drink. And the booze, which we've heard this before, unleashed his inner homicidal maniac. He said it was the whiskey that did it. He wrote that in the postcards as well. So basically he said when he was drunk, the desire to kill boys came over him and it was uncontrollable. Hickey's attorney files an insanity plea at his trial for Joey's murder in December of 1912. And ultimately, they think that he's going to get... like the psychiatrist, the lawyers, they all think he should get a first-degree murder conviction because he's admitting to these things. He doesn't. It takes forever for the jury to reach a verdict. The deliberations last days and days and days. And finally, they convict him of second-degree murder, which carried a sentence of 20 years to life. And this is not a popular decision. The Buffalo Sunday Times noted that public consensus was that he was a degenerate fiend who he somehow escaped punishment, and that the justified punishment would have been, life in prison or death. Basically, they wanted him to have the chair, is what they said. And 10 years later, in 1922, Hickey had a brain hemorrhage, and he died in Auburn. He never again erupted into a murderous rage because he was only surrounded by adult men, and he never sent another postcard. This story, I think he's a turn-of-the-century killer. I think this type of killer would have appealed to Israel Keyes.
So here was what was happening there. This guy is a confessed murderer, but he said that it's the devil's whiskey that made him do it. And there was actually like some thought put into it by these, quote, experts, end quote, of these different things, because we're talking about 1912, right?
Yeah, the trial was in December of 1912.
Right. And so you've got people actually saying, they're contemplating, like, well, alcohol really does mess up your head. And like, how much of that is really his fault? And, you're still responsible for your actions even when you do drink. And of course, that's how the law has, come to be shaped as time goes on.
There's a lot of people that, okay, this does not excuse their actions, but like, look, we spent a lot of time talking about Ted Bundy. And something about Ted Bundy and alcohol, I firmly believe that it allowed him to do things he couldn't do sober.
I've never even thought about that.
He loosened himself. It loosened him up enough to where he couldn't drive. I know that for sure.
Man,
I mean, that's how he gets caught.
That's how all good bad serial killers get caught.
And Keys had a DUI.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
he also got pulled over. That's how he was arrested.
Well, he got pulled over because I don't think that was bad driving.
He was speeding. That was the probable cause.
3 miles over, yeah.
But here's the thing, like the way the story reads, and who knows if this is true or not, but it's almost like if he hadn't have gone over the speed limit, like the
LA had no reason to pull him.
And it seems like they would have actually like not pulled him, which is really good. But at the same time, like I'm glad he had a lead foot that day.
Thank you for joining us for our Cruel Summer episodes, where we go back to looking at Israel Keys. We are sponsored by LabRottiCreations.com. You can check them out at LabRottiCreations.com, and you can still use the code CRIMEXS for a fun pop pet portrait of your own pet. You can also reach us on Twitter, Instagram at TrueCrimeXS, or you can give us a call if you know anything about any of the cases that we're talking about at 252-365-5593. You can also reach us at Gmail at truecrimexs@gmail.com, and you can check out our website at www.truecrimexs.com. We'll see you next time. This is True Crime XS.
From 2007 to 2010, almost into 2011, you have all these weird fires in upstate New York that are happening. You can actually look for it. If you punch in arson probe and you include the Mill Fire, they have a spate of fires. And the way they describe it is it's abandoned buildings, homes without power, commercial buildings without power. And they said they have a person of interest, but they never charged them. They never identified them. And all of them are unsolved. In fact, they refuse to identify most of the locations. It starts where the mill is and it goes back north. But it's a total of about 30 fires of these abandoned, and most of these structures are for sale, by the way, which is interesting. I think if you were to tag them all, if they were to give up the times of the fires and the incident reports related to them, I bet all of these fires are around times that Israel Keys is in New York. And I've made my case for a couple of these like larger fires. The biggest one is the Mill Fire. And I think there's remains at the mill or close to there. I think the point of when the structure collapsed and when it got set on fire, I think it was to disguise the remains because I don't think anyone looked for them. You can still see some of the rubble. I spent a lot of time staring at all the media in this case, and that's the videos and listening to the audio and the pictures and the files. And, every time you look at a thing, you can find something new there. Like here's the thing for you. You've got these 11 skulls in the Baphomet that the FBI reveals on Dateline. When they do that, nobody says anything about the fact that in the center of the forehead of each skull is like a tiny X or a cross. Even on the Baphomet, so all 12 of them have this symbol. So that's another thing that I get to thinking, like what does that symbol mean? Because it's got to be significant. It's on every single image. But I do wonder if people, if you start Googling these things, these symbols, like just start searching for them on the internet, like what would you find? Like the skulls with the X's. Or what happens if you Google Common Grounds Espresso or Common Grounds Coffee Shop? And that gets really interesting. There's a lot of different things that you come across if you start putting different key phrases together. And if you go back into the web archives and start doing it, it's even more interesting.
Things, but I could never help you find the way. So if you're ever walking next to me, you can't believe a single word I say. Hey. And oh, maybe this time get some sleep tonight. And oh, if it's not too quiet outside. And oh, I could get some sleep tonight. A story, please make it boring. I've never seen myself in me, but I can't find my feet without a candle. So if you notice anything, please pretend it's something I can handle. And oh, maybe this time. And oh, I could get some sleep tonight. It's not too quiet outside. And no, I could get some sleep tonight.